They were told the paint was harmless, and so the habit took root in them without a second thought. The brush drew to a point between the lips, dipped once more into the glowing paste, drawn again across the face of a watch, and again, until the motion no longer belonged to thought at all. Thousands of times a day, every day, dust settled in their hair, their lungs, the seams of their dresses, and at dusk they walked home glowing faintly, like something not quite of this world. The neighbors had a name for them already. They called them ghosts, and then their teeth began to fall out. This is a story that begins with light. Not the light of understanding, that comes later and for most of the women in it, far too late, but with a literal light, pale, green, faintly luminous, mixed by hand and painted onto the faces of watches so that a soldier in a trench or a woman in a dark bedroom could read the hour without striking a match. It begins in New Jersey, in the spring of 1917, in a room full of long tables and young women who believed, because they had been told to believe it, that what they held between their fingers could do them no harm at all. Radium killed slowly enough that, for the first 15 years of its public life, almost no one noticed it killing anyone at all. That was the danger of it. Not that it lied exactly, but rather that it took its time telling the truth. It had been pulled out of pitchblende by a woman in Paris who would herself die of what it did to blood, though no one knew that yet either. It went into toothpaste, into tonic water, into cosmetics that promised a living glow to the skin. Newspapers ran advertisements for radium suppositories, radium chocolate, even radium lace condoms, each claiming without a flicker of doubt to be dispensing vitality itself. The element did not merely cure, it illuminated, and to a decade still dazzled by electricity, illumination looked exactly like proof. So when the United States Radium Corporation opened its dial painting studio in Orange, New Jersey, it did not look like a factory. It looked like a gift. Young women, many of them barely out of adolescence, were offered extraordinary wages to do delicate, almost artistic work in a clean, well-lit room, painting the faces of watches, clocks, an aircraft instrument with a compound that would let a soldier read the time, even in a trench at midnight. It was patriotic work. It was a well-paid work, and they were told, in terms that left no room for doubt, that it was entirely safe. On the 10th of April 1917, 4 days after the United States entered a war that had already swallowed a generation of European men, an 18-year-old named Grace Fryer walked through the doors of that studio for her first shift. She had 2 brothers already in uniform. She wanted to do her part, but she had no way of knowing that the war she was stepping into that morning was not the one being fought in France, and that hers would not end for 16 years. The paint itself was strange and beautiful. Glue, water, and radium powder stirred into a pale luminescent green. Some of the women, laughing, touched the brushful to their teeth or their nails before a night out. Stardust, borrowed for an evening. When Grace blew her nose after a shift, her handkerchief glowed faintly in the dark of her bedroom. She thought it was strange. She had no reason yet to think it was a warning. But the corporation had every reason to know better, and they did. Down the same corridor in its own laboratories, chemists handled radium behind LED screens, in masks, with tongues built to keep the element at a careful, deliberate distance. The company's own publication circulated to hospitals, and physicians ran to pages of citations under the heading Radium Dangers, Injurious Effects. Some were more than a decade old. None of that caution reached the women at the long tables. What did reach them instead was a technique the company taught as a routine. Years later, Grace herself would describe it under oath in these exact words. Our instructors told us to point our brushes with our lips. I think I pointed mine with my lips about 6 times to every watch dial. It didn't taste funny, it didn't have any taste, and I didn't think it was harmful. Wet the brush, bring it to a point between the lips, dip it in the glowing paste, paint the numeral, repeat, without exaggeration, several thousand times a day. They were told to swallow the thing that would kill them, and told in the same breath that it could do them no harm at all. There is a particular horror in repetition. Not the horror of an event, but the one of a habit. What happened to the dial painters did not happen to them in a single moment of catastrophe. It happened to them one brush up at a time, over months, over years, absorbed into bone with the same patience the women brought to their work. Radium, it would later be understood, behaves in the body as calcium's counterfeit. The skeleton, unable to distinguish the imposter from the genuine article, welcomes it in. It settles into the jaw, the spine, the long bones of the leg, and it does not leave. It sits there, emitting its quiet violence into the marrow and tissue for as long as the bone itself survives, which is to say for a lifetime, and in a grim sense beyond it. Decades later, exhumations of dial painters would still register on a Geiger counter. The women had not merely been exposed to radium, they had become, in the coldest possible sense, radioactive artifacts of their own employment. But in 1917, none of this had a name yet. What the woman had instead was a side effect that felt at the time almost like a gift. They were, for a brief window of history, the most literally radiant women in America, and they were, without a single one of them knowing it, being irradiated from the inside out. It is worth resisting the urge here to linger too long on the visual portrait of it, the glowing girls walking home under gaslight, because the portrait belongs to the tragedy that follows, not to some separate aesthetic pleasure. The glow was not a gift, it was a signature the element left behind, the only visible evidence, for a little while, that anything was happening to them at all. The first among them to be called to account was a young woman named Amelia Magia, Molly to the women who worked beside her. She was one of Grace Fryer's own colleagues on the line. It began, as it would begin for so many of the others, with a toothache. In the autumn of 1921, she saw a dentist named Joseph Kneff, a man with some reputation for treating unusual conditions of the mouth. He pulled the offending tooth. The wound did not close. Instead, it wept pus and blood. It refused every ordinary rule of healing, and when the tooth beside it began to ache in turn, he pulled that one too. Same result. By the following spring, her jaw itself had begun to fail her, not merely to hurt, but to change, structurally, beneath his hands. In May of 1922, Kneff examined her again and found an abscess he judged serious enough to warrant surgery. What he found beneath it altered the entire shape of what this story would become. The bone of her jaw was no longer the pale, dense material a jaw is meant to be. It had turned ashen, porous, wrong. He touched it, gently, the way a physician touches a patient he does not yet wish to alarm, and it broke apart beneath his fingertip like something already dead. By summer, what remained of her jaw was removed entirely, along with pieces of the delicate bone of her inner ear. She could no longer eat without agony. She could barely speak. A young woman, once known by every account for her laughter, spent her final months nearly silent, a folded handkerchief pressed constantly to a face that would not stop bleeding. On the 12th of September 1922, the disease that had been eating through her jaw for the better part of a year reached her jugular vein. At 5 in the afternoon it opened. There was nothing left to hold it closed. She died within minutes, drowning in the most literal and merciless sense in her own blood. She was 24. Her death certificate did not even mention radium. What is listed depends on which record survives. Some accounts give the word syphilis outright, others, more clinical, says ulcerative stomatitis. Either way, to the physicians of 1922, the diagnosis carried the same weight of suspicion, whether or not the harsher word was ever actually written down. By the time Molly Magia was buried, the corporation's own physicians had already examined more than one ailing dial painters and found, on paper, nothing whatsoever wrong with her. A young woman would arrive complaining of a toothache that would not close, of a fatigue no night's sleep could touch, of a hip that ached in a way no woman her age should have to explain to a doctor twice her senior. She would leave with a diagnosis of rheumatism or anemia of no particular cause, or, on occasion, nothing more specific than nerves, each file closed as quietly as it opened. Whatever the precise word on that certificate, its effect on Molly's family was the same. A county clerk filled it without comment. Neighbors repeated the association without question, because it did not occur to most of them to doubt the physician's judgment. A diagnosis like that one needed no further elaboration. It could change how a grieving family was spoken of at church, at market, in the street outside their own front door. It cost the corporation nothing to let that association stand uncorrected. It cost the Magia family considerably more. Grace Fryer heard it too. She had stood beside Molly at the long tables for years. She had seen at close range exactly what those wounds looked like before anyone had a name for them, and she knew that the disease had begun with the same brush every woman in that room still carried to work each morning. She began, quietly and at her own expense, to visit physicians outside the company's approved list, a decision that cost her money she did not have, in pursuit of an answer no one closer to her seemed willing to put in writing. More women began to fall ill in the months that followed, each in her own particular register of suffering. Aching hips that would not respond to rest, spines that seemed, on examination, to be quietly dissolving from within, sarcomas, vast cruel tumors blooming in the bones that had once been simply bones. Grace herself began to feel it in her teeth, in her feet, in a fatigue that no sleep seemed to answer. Company physicians, when consulted, offered diagnoses that ranged from the merely mistaken to the actively exculpatory. Rheumatism, anemia of no particular origin, and even occasionally nothing at all beyond the suggestion that the women in question were only prone to worry. Outside the factory, the scientific record was by now unambiguous. Radium's dangers had been documented in medical literature for well over a decade. Inside it, the message delivered to the women who mixed the paint with their own saliva remained essentially the same: harmless, even, on occasion, healthful. The same rhetoric that sold radium chocolate to the public was not entirely absent from the reassurances offered to the workforce that handled the substance in its rawest form. Grace Fryer did what her circumstances allowed her to do, which was to start asking questions no one in her position was expected to ask. She sought out specialists on her own initiative, outside the company's approved physicians, and in doing so, she began to assemble piece by piece, appointment by appointment, a case that no single doctor, paid or otherwise, had been willing to build for her. It took Grace nearly 2 years to find a lawyer willing to take a case against the corporation as entrenched as United States Radium. Raymond Berry finally agreed, and in 1927 the suit was filed. Grace Fryer was joined by 4 of her former colleagues, Catherine Schaub, Quinta MacDonald, Albina Rees, and Edna Hossman. The press, with the particular appetite it reserved for a story too grim to look away from, gave the case a name that needed no embellishment: the case of the 5 women doomed to die. Grace never spoke of the case as something she owed herself. She said, "It is not for myself I care. I am thinking more of the hundreds of girls to whom this may serve as an example." That name was not sensationalism. It was, by the medical standards of the day, simple accuracy. Each of the 5 women who stood as plaintiffs did so already carrying a diagnosis that offered them no realistic future. They were suing not to reclaim their health, which was already beyond reclaiming, but to have acknowledged, on record, under oath, that what had been done to them had been done knowingly. The company fought the case with every available delay, understanding, correctly, that time itself was a weapon that favored the defense. Each month of legal maneuvering was a month closer to a courtroom with an empty chair where plaintiff had been. The woman's own physical decline became, in the cruelest possible way, part of the trial's own clock. Some could barely raise an arm to be sworn in, but it did not matter. They persisted anyway, understanding, perhaps better than anyone in that courtroom, that their bodies were no longer instrument for their own survival, but only for the survival of the truth they carried. In 1928, before the case could reach a jury, it was settled. $10,000 to each woman, a further $600 a year for as long as she lived, and every medical and legal expense already incurred paid in full by the company. Set against what had been taken from them, it was a modest sum, and everyone in the courtroom seemed to understand it as such. Catherine Schaub did not live to see much of it spent. She died in February 1933, at 30 years old. Grace Fryer followed her that October, at 34. But the settlement was never really the point, and each of them in her own way seemed to understand that. What mattered was that the mechanism of denial had, for the first time, been forced into open court and named for what it was: the diagnosis of convenience, the company physician's reassurance, the silent policy of protecting the laboratory while abandoning the factory floor. It would be a comforting shape for this story to take if the settlement of 1928 had closed the matter permanently, if the case of the 5 women doomed to die had been the last of its kind. It was not. A decade after the New Jersey settlement, in the small town of Ottawa, Illinois, another company was still handing women brushes and telling them to bring the bristles to a point between their lips. The Radium Dial Company had followed the New Jersey case in the same newspapers its own workers read, and in 1925, the same year Grace Fryer began investigating, 2 states away, Radium Dial began sending its own dial painters to a physician. The women were never told why. Their blood was drawn, their breath was tested for radioactivity. The results went into a company file. The women never saw it. What they were told every time was that they were in excellent health. Catherine Wolfe was one of them. She began to limp in 1925, a small unevenness in her steps that widened over the following years into something impossible to hide. In 1931, Radium Dial dismissed her. She would later say that it wasn't for the limp itself, but because the limp had become something people in town had started to notice and talk about. By the mid-1930s, Catherine, married now and known as Catherine Donahue, a mother of 2, had lost most of her teeth. Her jaw began to come apart the way Molly Magias had 13 years in one state away, in a case Radium Dial's own executives could have read about in any newspaper in Ottawa. She kept the fragments as they came loose, and when her case finally reached the Illinois Industrial Commission in 1937, she brought with her a small box to the hearings. Inside it were pieces of her own jawbone entered into evidence like exhibit from a crime scene, and in every sense that mattered, that is exactly what they were. The hearing in February of 1938 did not go the way hearings are supposed to go. A doctor, questioned about her chances of recovery, gave an answer that left no room for hope, and Catherine Donahue collapsed into the courtroom before she could hear the rest of it. She weighed, by that point, 71 pounds. The proceedings continued afterward at her home because she was no longer strong enough to be moved. Her attorney, in his own closing argument, did not reach for restraint. He called the company a predator. He told the commission that the radium inside Catherine Donahue would go on working long after the hearing ended, that it would, in his own words, bombard through her very casket the way it had already wrecked her jaw and her hip. On the 5th of April 1938, the Illinois Industrial Commission ruled in her favor. Radium Dial appealed the decision, lost, and appealed again, all the way up through the state courts, spending by the end far more in legal fees than it would ever owe in damages. Catherine Donahue did not live to see the appeals exhausted. She died on the 27th of July 1938, a few months after her case was decided, at 35 years old. What makes Ottawa harder to sit with than Orange is not that the suffering was worse. Radium did not grow crueler in the 13 years between them. It's the calendar. Every mechanism that failed Molly Magia and Grace Fryer in 1922 was by 1931 a matter of public record. The leap-pointing technique, the denied diagnosis, the company physicians who told the worker one thing to her face and wrote another in a file she was never permitted to see. Radium Dial did not fail to learn the lessons of New Jersey. It learned them precisely, and it used them. What the Radium girls won in the end was not their own survival. It was something that outlived them by design, a body of case law and a regulatory precedent that reshaped how the United States governed the relationship between an employer and the substances it asked its worker to handle. Their suffering, documented so precisely because their body would not let it be otherwise, gave American labor law one of its foundational arguments, that a worker has the right to know in plain terms what she's being asked to hold in her hands. There is a particular cruelty in the fact that the very thing which made these women glamorous, the glow, the shimmer, the light that clung to their skin after every shift, was also the thing that was killing them. For years, no one told them the two were the same. They were not consumed by something monstrous or foreign. They were consumed by beauty, marketed to them as a gift, administered as an instruction, and left in their bones long after the company that profited from it had moved on to other work. They are remembered now by the name history settled on them, the Radium Girls, a phrase that still carries something of the wonder that first drew them through the factory doors. But it is worth remembering too that they did not choose to glow. They chose to work, to help, to earn a living in the middle of a war that asked something of everyone. The light was not their vanity. It was simply what remained visible of everything that had been taken from them without their consent. That is the reason, more than a century later, that their story is still being told at all. Hey, thank you for watching this video. It was probably a bit long, but I wanted to make it something special. More than just a story, a very humble tribute to a reality that many still experience today. If you enjoyed the video, please let me know. And if you did not, please let me know that too. Constructive criticism and advice are the only ways to improve, for me at least. And I do hope to deliver increasingly high quality content over time. I'll see you in the next episode, and in the meantime, take care.